Secure your tinfoil hats, buckle down tight, and hold on loosely as we soar over the rocky tops of the La Platas on a rocky mountain high, get sucked into the vortex of the Four Corners, and settle down snugly at mile marker 420 in colorful Colorado. It is Sunday, August 1st, Monday, August 2nd. For those of you across the pond and beyond, welcome to We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. Today is Friendship Day, so I'm so grateful for those of you that are joining us because you are our friends. I'm your host, TessaTNT, and I'm so glad to see you here. If you're listening live, you may be listening on Spreaker.com, or you can also find us live on KPNL Radio, which you can find at kpnl-db.com. You can also find us on Twitter, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, CastBox, Tumblr, YouTube, SoundCloud, TuneIn Radio, Deezer, as well as Podcast Addict and Podcast Chaser. So tonight, we were going to do the Paradox Paranormal Forum, but dates got switched around because certain people got double booked. So we were going to do the forum tonight, but I just can't see doing two forums in 1 month. So I just figured I might just read you guys some stories today. Welcome, Champ. Welcome, Mr. Morris. It's good to see you guys. Yeah, Champ came in and said happy birthday. I'm like, it's not my birthday, but I do believe it could be We Are Paradox Media's birthday. I'll have to check that out on break and see when exactly we kicked off. Yeah, that'd be super cool if it is our birthday this evening. So the book we're going to be reading tonight is 50 Strange Stories of the Supernatural, and these are true accounts of weird and otherworldly happenings, and it's edited by John Canning. And included in this volume are true accounts of weird and otherworldly incidents by Michael Blee, Douglas Collier, Patrick Dugan, Andrew Ewart, Ian Fellows Gordon, Michael and Molly Hardwick, Dottie Hay, Charles Eric Main, Ronald Seth, Claire Smith, Rosemary Timperley, James Wentworth Day, and Lawrence Wilson. So we're going to start with the editor's note, because he's got some interesting things to say in here. And this book I actually inherited from my grandpa. I got all of his paranormal, supernatural, and books of the like. And a lot of those I was very surprised to see were Sylvia Browne books. I'm not a huge Sylvia Browne nut, but I found that interesting that he was actually into that. All right. Editor's note. Too many, especially in the West, increasing affluence seems to have been accompanied by a growing lack of meaning in their lives. They have come to see that a greatly improved standard of living does not of itself bring happiness or fulfillment, and this realization has brought a disenchantment with science and a yearning for a new dimension in experience which will help them to regain a sense of direction. To these people, it seems evident that science cannot explain everything or solve all problems. For modern technology, despite its blessings, has created a polluted planet, and science cannot throw much light on experiences such as love or the sense of beauty, perhaps the most important things in life. Already alienated from organized religion, science had made deep inroads among the faithful. Men and women have recently been showing a quickening interest in psychic phenomena. If there are really such powers as precognition, telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis, then perhaps these may provide a means for contact with a reality not available through the five senses. Even since the creation of the British Society for Psychical Research in 1882, there have always been men of science who have interested themselves in parapsychology. Among early members of the SPR were the physicist Sir William Barrett, Oliver Lodge, and William Crookes, the astronomer Camille Flammarion, and the psychologist William James. but they were a small minority among their skeptical colleagues. Now, even within the scientific world, attitudes are changing, with the United States leading the way. The Stanford Institute has run tests on Uri Geller, and at the Menninger Foundation in Topeka, Kansas, researchers have been impressed with the skills of a middle-aged man named Jack Swartz, who appears to have similar powers over his bodily process to those of the Tara Bay, whose exploits are described in this book. The U.S. government itself is now prepared to support psychic research. The National Institute of Mental Health has recently granted Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn funds for tests in extrasensory perception, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration has financed a Stanford Research Institution program to teach ESP skills to NASA personnel. All this is a very long way indeed from J.B. Rhine's card-guessing experiments at Duke University in the 1930s, and a strong indication that parapsychology and the occult will be a major field of research in the future. But these subjects are also completely fascinating for the general reader. At the level purely of entertainment, though inevitably there is information too for those who would know more, I have endeavored to bring together here some of the strange and startling events from the realms of the occult. These range in time from the Middle Ages to the present, and in character from folk myths and hauntings to seemingly supernormal powers displayed under near-clinical conditions. In several of these chapters, where the events recounted might have caused pain or embarrassment to surviving relatives, I have changed names and geographical locations. The essential facts, however, remain true. In the case of folk legends, the contributors have endeavored to reconstruct the stories as convincingly as possible within the framework of ascertainable historical fact. And that was written by editor Mr. John Canning. So this next, or the first portion of this book, I want to say chapter, but I believe they're called sectors or sections. Let me look. Here it just says content. The Mysterious Orient. So this is Madame Blavatsky and the Mahatmas. Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was a truly remarkable woman. Her forceful, colorful, vital character fascinated people, made her many friends, but often alienated them. Although she was proved to the satisfaction of almost everybody to be a fraud in some things, her teaching has survived to this day. It is impossible not to concede that she possessed remarkable powers, nor to admire her courage, perseverance, and enthusiasm, even in the face of ridicule and hardship. She was born in Ekaterinslav, Russia, in 1831. Her father, a German in the service of the Tsar and governor of the district, was of noble blood, and on her mother's side she was the granddaughter of Princess Helen Dolgoruki, whose ancestors were closely connected with the reigning family. Helena was a premature baby, sickly and weak. For this reason, her baptism was quickly arranged, a priest and a witness summoned. As the priest pronounced on her behalf the renunciation of the devil, his robes caught fire and several people were badly burned. This was considered in the locality to be an evil omen, and nobody was surprised when the child seemed to be bewitched. Nymphs and goblins were her constant companions, at least in her own mind, and her imaginings so affected the household that she was constantly being sprinkled with holy water in an effort to exorcise the spirits. For a while, in her teens, Helena traveled widely with her father. This broadened her outlook, only made her more independent, and served to persuade her much-tried family that the best way to suppress her unhealthy interest in spirits, death, and the occult would be to marry her off. A match was arranged between the 17-year-old girl and General Blavatsky, governor of Yerevan. This unfortunate man was described by his wife as being 26 and 70 years old, and a plumeless raven. It is more likely that he was under 50, for he was still alive 30 years later, and certainly he had a great deal to put up with from the lively, independent girl. It is well known that for those women practicing the occult sciences, a state of virginity is extremely important. Whether or not the marriage was consummated, and Madame Blavatsky strongly denied it through her life, it lasted a very short time. After repeated quarrels, the young wife left and set out on her travels. Later, HPB, as she was called for most of her life, told her friends that from Russia she went to Cairo, where she became a pupil of an old Copt possessing magic powers, and thence to Paris, where she met Daniel Douglas Home, the noted spiritualist who wished to train her as a medium. It is possible that HPB learned a great deal from him, although years later she was at pains to refute spiritualism and to opt a completely different motive for producing her marvels. Her travels continued. In Quebec, she sought out Indian tribes in the search of knowledge, and in New Orleans learnt much of voodoo, that necromantic cult about which, at that time, few white people knew anything. At this time, HPB's philosophy, later to be taught to so many, was already forming in her receptive and imaginative mind. The vision of an Indian, tall, dignified, and stern, whom she recognized as a messenger from Tibetan adepts in the occult, had appeared to her once or twice in her youth. Now she determined to visit Tibet and seek out the masters who could initiate her into the true knowledge. Although she said later that she had taken the full 7 years initiation, the time she spent there was certainly only as many as months. Her means, supplied irregularly by her father, were not sufficient to allow her to travel indefinitely, and in 1858, after 10 years wandering, she returned home to Russia. From her arrival, she was a successful. Those who remembered her as a child were now adults and only too anxious to learn their futures and to hear from their dead friends. Madame Blavatsky was able to oblige them to the extent of raped or written replies to mental questions, to provide prescriptions, cures, and manifestations. That she had considerable sense of humor is shown by her revenge on a lady who doubted her powers. When this person asked her to name the best conductor for these occult rappings from the spirits, she received the word gold. At the same instant she rose to her feet, hand to mouth. The gold fillings of her teeth had been firmly wrapped. Another phenomenon which HPB at that time demonstrated was a change in weight of either inanimate or animate objects. On one occasion, merely by fixing it with a concentrated gaze, she succeeded in making a small chess table so heavy that several people were quite unable to lift it. After a number of attempts had been made, HPB carelessly waved her hand and looked away. The table again became its normal weight. Perhaps her most difficult convert at that time was her father. He was not only indifferent to her marvels, but pronounced them bosh. One day, however, he let himself be persuaded by 2 old friends to go into another room and write one word, unknown to anyone, on a piece of paper. He returns saying that if his daughter could persuade her spirits to rap out what he had written, he would be forced at last to believe her and consider himself also as a proper subject for incarceration in a lunatic asylum. Without touching the plate, which was a sounding board for the raps, HPB watched with amusement while the answer was received. On seeing the transcription, her father trembled and became very pale. It was the word he had written, and such an odd one, the name of a favorite horse, and that there was no possibility of guessing work. This served to convert him to belief in his daughter's powers, and thereafter was proud of her success and supported her until his death a few years later. After a while, HPB's wanderlust overtook her again. Eventually, she settled in Cairo, where she founded the Society Spirit and earned her living for a time as a medium. This period was notable only for the fact that she made a friend of Madame Coulomb, who provided both money and hospitality, but who later in her life became her chief detractor, bringing down, like a card of house, the reputation HPB had worked for so many years to achieve. These earlier chapters of Madame Blavatsky's life are only partly authenticated, and it is from the time of her arrival in America in the early 1870s that her meeting with Colonel Henry Alcott that her known story begins. Alcott, her chronicler, had a great regard for the truth, and although he may have given her the benefit of the doubt in many instances, he was also a journalist, a man of inquiring mind, and no fool. Madame Blavatsky was the spring from which the Theosophical Society fed, but the colonel was an administrator as well as a believer. Although their relationship could at times be stormy, this combination of talents created a belief which continues, admittedly, among only a small minority to this day. Colonel Alcott always had a considerable interest in spiritualism, and in October 1847 was present at a demonstration by two mediums, the Eddy brothers, when a colorful and compelling sight caught his attention. At this time, HPB, dressed in a bright red shirt, may not have been so corpulent as she afterwards became, but her figure and personality dominated any room she occupied. She herself, with characteristic lack of physical vanity, described her appearance as Kalmuco-Buddhisto-Tartaric. Her broad, flat face and ungraceful figure were redeemed by fine, narrow hands, bedecked with rings, and by her large, expressive, compelling gray-blue eyes. All this was topped by light brown hair, very thick, centrally parted, and as crinkled as sheep's wool. The elegant hands were stained brown from the cigarettes which she constantly smoked, rolling them herself, and in those days it was a strange habit for a woman. Her speech was polyglot and strewn with oaths. Nevertheless, before that first evening ended, Colonel Alcott was fascinated by her. Moreover, he noticed that the Eddy brothers and other mediums enjoyed greater success when HPB was present at a séance, for it ensured that only genuine spirits were called up. Not only this, but these other mediums were controlled by their spirits, while HPB, in similar circumstances, was commanding the spirits to do her will in full awareness. As a result of Colonel Alcott's interest and complimentary articles in the newspapers, HPB achieved a formidable reputation in America. She took an apartment in New York, which she called the Lamasery, and which she filled with a motley collection of stuffed creatures, snakes, monkeys, owls, even a lion's head glared down from the walls. Buddhas, cuckoo clocks, and canaries crowded the little Japanese cabinets. And in the midst of this, HPB held court, chain-smoking, wrapped in her favorite garment, a greasy red flannel dressing gown. The effect would have seemed ludicrous, but such was her enthusiasm and magnetism that she gathered round her the elite of all those aspirants and occult knowledge with which America at that time abounded. In 1875 came the turning point in her life. From spiritualism, Madame Blavatsky decided to turn to the masters who, she had long thought, would guide her to the discovery and diffusions of the knowledge of the laws governing the universe. To that end, she, Colonel Olcott, and W.Q. Judge, a devoted occultist, founded the Theosophical Society. The aim of the society was to supersede or control the forces of nature through the adepts, those masters of lore living in Tibet, who through long initiation have attained the astral plane. These masters, or Mahatmas, could materialize themselves and other natural objects where they wished, see past and future, and prolong their own lives at will. They could use their powers for evil, and indeed there were, according to H.P.B., some who did, but the society was interested only in the good. Although the society became fairly well established, H.P.B. and the colonel soon ran into financial difficulties, and there was not enough money to expand the society. So it was with relief that H.P.B. and the colonel welcomed into their circle the old, infirm, and apparently rich Baron de Palm. Soon after becoming one of the initiates, this gentleman made a will leaving everything he possessed to Olcott for the use of the society, then almost immediately died. The society received many congratulations in their inheritance, but alas, for their hopes, the baron's vaunted riches and lands proved entirely imaginary. He had lived for years at others' expense, and this was his last joke. Worse was to follow. Already made to look ridiculous, the society was brought into further disrepute by a very injudicious act on the part of H.P.B. herself. For the reason which no one can explain, and bigamously since General Blavatsky was still alive, she married a coarse Armenian, many years younger than herself. Perhaps she believed him to be rich. At any rate, she never allowed the marriage to be consummated, and after a few months, during which time she discovered he had no money after all, she left him. About this time, her first book, Isis Unveiled, was published. It was a remarkable work, a hodgepodge of beliefs, religions, and legends from all times and places. Olcott, who was with her as she wrote, testified that he was completely convinced that at times the author was not H.P.B., but a Mahatma inhabiting her body temporarily. Certainly, such differences of style, literacy, and language in one work are hard to explain. The book went some way towards redeeming H.P.B.'s reputation, but she now decided that for a while she wished to study rather than teach, and she and Olcott determined to go to India. A society called the Arya Samaj had recently been formed there to revive the ancient and mystic principles of the Hindu religion, and its leader had corresponded for some time with Olcott. In answer to an invitation to visit India and exchange ideas, the colonel and H.P.B. embarked. On their arrival at Bombay in 1879, the colonel made an instantly favorable impression by stooping and kissing the ground. The Arya Samaj welcomed them lavishly, although their motives were not entirely pure. They were delighted that an American organization, the Theosophical Society, was favorable to Indian hopes of self-government. And indeed, H.P.B. perhaps carried her enthusiasm for Indian aspirations too far, since for quite some time after her arrival she was shadowed by police. Madame Blavatsky realized that she could not totally ignore the European community if she were successfully to establish the Society A.P. Sinet. The editor of the Pioneer, an important English-language newspaper, had written to her on her arrival. As an enthusiastic occultist, he was prepared to give her his support, and she was eventually do all she could do to win his confidence and allegiance. However, until she could meet him, she and the colonel traveled to many places in India, questioning ascetics, fakirs, and swamis in the search for knowledge. A few months after their arrival in India, HPB and Alcott produced the first copy there of the Theosophical magazine. Apart from fascinating articles on Western occultism and other subjects on which she could be supposed to be informed, Oriental philosophy and Vedas, Hindu sacred writings, and similar matters were discussed vivaciously and accurately. The magazine was a great success and did much to establish HPB's reputation in India. Eventually, she and Colonel Alcott were invited to Allahabad to stay with A.P. Sinnett and his wife. Disconcerted at first by her rough manners and strange appearance, Sinnett found to his belief that his friends considered her a fascinating eccentric. She was invited to many houses, principally One Images, for the marvels well publicized by the ever-busy Alcott, which she could perform. At this time, however, HPB was disinclined to perform any monkey tricks, as she insisted on calling them, claiming that her masters were against the casual showing of phenomena and that knowledge should not be used in this way. Later, in order to prove the existence of these same adepts, she was to relax this rule time and time again. Sinnett and the others of the growing band of Indian Theosophists were in no doubt at all that, despite her tantrums when requested to produce marvels, HPB had been chosen by the masters to be their representative, although they were disappointed that they themselves could not receive a message from or manifestation of the supreme beings. The arrival of her old friends, the Columns, in India, delighted HPB. Also, it must be admitted that HPB was no sort of housekeeper and was grateful for this work to be taken over by her friend. Her household was also included Domodar, a tubercular and pathetic youth who had severed connections with his well-to-do family in order to join HPB. With her household thus in safekeeping, HPB traveled to Ceylon with Alcott at the invitation of Buddhist high priests. Their welcome on this island far outdid any previously encountered, and they felt themselves so attuned to the Buddhist religion that they immediately became initiated into it. Although several branches of the Theosophical Society were established in Ceylon, their success among the Buddhists did them no service with their associates of Hindu society Arya Samaj. On the return to India of HPB and Alcott, the leader of this society, suggested that they should dissolve their partnership. This was agreed, but after a while, the Arya Samaj went further, denigrating the Theosophists, giving publicity to their lack of an exact dogma, and even their lack of funds. Happily, it did little harm to Madame Blavatsky. She was very busy building a new, more dramatic doctrine. When Sinnett again invited her to stay, the Madame Blavatsky announced that she had at last the direct guidance of an adept Mahatma Kudhumi. No longer was she a tyro unfit to produce the proof of the existence of the initiates. On the contrary, she was happy to communicate their wishes, gifts, and opinions to those deserving of them. At any dinner party or gathering, messages would be distributed from the astral plane, etheric music heard, and objects moved by an unseen agency. 2 notable marvels took place, both in broad daylight. Mrs. Sinnett, while out for a walk, confided in HPB that what she really needed to confirm her belief in the Mahatmas was a materialized and personal note from one of them. HPB wrote upon a piece of paper, crumpled it in her hand, and without moving away, indicated a tree nearby. Impaled on a twig was a similar note with the message, "I believe I was requested to leave a note here. What do you want with me?" The signature was in Tibetan characters. Miss Sinnett was sure that this could only have happened through a supernatural agency, and indeed it greatly enhanced Madame Blavatsky's reputation. The next sensational episode took place in the presence of impartial strangers and had even more impact. HPB, Colonel Alcott, and the Sinnetts arranged a picnic with another lady and a Major Henderson, not a theosophist. Their baskets were packed, and on their way they were joined by an English judge who asked to come with them. On their arrival at the picnic spot, it was realized that there were only 6 cups and saucers for 7 people. It was suggested to HPB that she should produce some convenient materialization. After looking about her for a few minutes, she pointed to a place in a small mound and asked Major Henderson to dig there with a knife. He took only a few moments to unearth a cup and saucer matching those in the picnic basket. One more phenomenon deserves mention. At a dinner in the house of a friend, Mr. Hume, HPB told Mrs. Hume that she would find any article of her that she particularly wanted, of course with the help of Koot Hoomy. Mrs. Hume asked for a pearl brooch and given away some time before. A little later, HPB told the company to search a particular flower bed, and there was the brooch wrapped in paper. After these remarkable feats, HPB was pressed by Hume, Sinnett, and others to produce a miracle of universal appeal. Perhaps she would cause a copy of the London Times to appear at Simla on the day of the publication in England. Sinnett found a reply from the master in his office a few days later. It explained that if such a miracle, easy enough to accomplish, should become known to the masses, it would cause worldwide disturbance, mobbing, and disruption. The only way to make everyone believe in the eternal truths was through a process of gradual enlightenment. Sinnett was flattered by the further advice. One witness of well-known character outweighs the evidence of 10 strangers. Work on the material you already have, and you will receive further proof. Despite these encouraging words, and a perfect flood of correspondence between Koot Hoomy and Sinnett, it proved impossible for either that gentleman or Mr. Hoomy to communicate with the master without HPB as an intermediary. Indeed, at the Sinnett's suggestion to Koot Hoomy that the advancement of the society would perhaps be better in his own hands, Koot Hoomy replied in no uncertain terms that in gratitude for the unceasing efforts of the 2 founders could form no part of the Theosophical Society. All these messages arrived in mysterious fashion, either falling to the floor from apparently thin air in front of the recipient, or pressed into their hands by no perceptible means, or perhaps merely throughout the long exchange of letters between Mahatma and Sinnett. The latter, though determined to use his normally considerable critical faculties, never doubted their provenance. The letters came to him, first in one handwriting, then in another, and some HPB freely admit to have written herself under her master's control. Perhaps Sinnett's admiration of her wholehearted absorption in the work of spreading theosophical knowledge, her courage in continuing her course despite difficulties, her capacity for hard and continuous concentration on her writing, all these things prevented his doubting her integrity. Over the next year or so, HPB was mainly concerned with her magazine and her writing. She also traveled throughout India, raising funds, producing phenomena, and learning from a variety of people. She became seriously ill with Bright's disease, accompanied by boils and ulcers. Although in a very low state of health, she made a long journey along the Darjeeling and then crossed into Sikkim. Once there, she said she met her masters and was quickly cured. Perhaps the most important incidents to take place after this were those in which, at last, Kut-Humi showed himself in his physical body to those theosophists who had despaired of even seeing their spiritual masters. On several occasions, a white-clad, dignified, and turbaned Indian appeared, gliding to and fro and remaining for several minutes before vanishing. There were many eyewitnesses to these longed-for manifestations, and the standing of the Theosophical Society had never been so high. At the Society's headquarters in Adyar, HPB had constructed a shrine or small cupboard containing portraits of the masters. This became famous as the spot in which messages from the Mahatmas were usually left even in HPB's absence. On one occasion, when she was away visiting friends, General Morgan, a man of unimpeachable character, called at her house in Adyar to see the shrine. As it was opened, a small dish fell out and shattered, which, to the distress of Madame Coulomb, she picked up the shards, wrapped them in cloth, put them back inside the shrine, and shut the doors, all the while lamenting the accident. The general, a little bored with all the fuss, said that if it was so important, the Mahatma had better mend it. At this, the consumptive young Damodar opened the doors to find not only a message from the Kut-Humi, but the dish completely intact. Though this incident had a great effect on both Europeans and Indians, it heralded the decline of HPB's golden years. The English branch of the society disapproved of the Buddhist influence, and there were charges of plagiarism and fraud to be answered. It appeared that Kut-Humi had repeated in one of his messages a long extract from a speech made by an American spiritualist 3 years before. Kut-Humi was righteously indignant at this lèse-majesté, but he was calm compared with the ebullient HPB. She flew into a royal rage, as she always did when her Mahatma was doubted. Another reason which decided her to return to England was that the committee of the Society for Physical Research, or Psychical Research, was anxious to interview her. Since Colonel Alcott was to accompany her to the interview, the Cullums were to stay on as caretakers. With these arrangements, which were to prove so disastrous, completed, HPB embarked again. Her meeting with the SPR did not go entirely smoothly. Sinnott also had come to England, and with him acting as liaison officer, it did not prove entirely disastrous. HPB gave full permission for a member of the committee to visit the Indian branches of the Theosophical Society and to make whatever investigations he thought proper. She was traveling in Europe when the blow fell. Her trusted friend, Madame Coulomb, feeling herself likely to be ousted in HPB's absence by other members of the society, and turned out to starve, resorted to blackmail. Abated by her husband, she demanded a large sum of money for keeping their mouths shut about the frauds they alleged HPB had perpetrated with their assistance. This money was refused, and the Coulomms immediately went to a missionary, a bitter enemy of HPB, and planned her ruin. Soon the Christian College magazine of Madras commenced publication of the Coulomb letters. If true, they were damning. They explained in full the broken dish of General Morgan, the manifestations of the Mahatma, and so on through all HPB's apparent marvels. All the letters, the Coulomms claimed, which had so convinced Sinnott and others, had been written by HPB and her associates and released by threads from roof beams or by mechanical means. The materialized Mahatma was none other than one of the Coulomms wearing a stuffed cotton mask, which they had made themselves to represent Kut-Humi. Alcott and HPB hurried back to India to refute these charges. If HPB could have brought a libel action against the Christian College magazine and her erstwhile friend, she might well have won. Handwriting experts were not unanimous, and the Coulomms not reputable people. However, Alcott thought it unwise, and perhaps he was right, to put so unstable and excitable a woman as HPB in the witness box. But HPB had another disaster to face. The investigator for the Society for Psychical Research produced his interim report. Despite the freedom he had been given to interrogate Theosophical Society members, the hospitality he had received, and the facilities given to him to examine the shrine and HPB's house, his report was annihilating. He denounced Madame Blavatsky as a complete impostor. Cruelly and unnecessarily, he also accused her of coming to India as a Russian spy. Whatever was discovered of HPB's deceptions, whether her powers were less or her ingenuity greater than her followers wished to think, no other of her detractors ever believed this last accusation. But to HPB, it was almost a death blow. Yet another tragic effect of the investigators' visit to Adyar was the death of the pathetic Damodar. He had done his utmost to uphold HPB against questioning, but had broken down and, seriously ill, he left Madras to travel north. Leaving Darjeeling to try to reach his masters, he froze to death on the road. Broken in health, Madame Blavatsky returned to England. As always, her courage and energy soon had her back to her writing. Denouncing the SPR, supplying Senate with all kinds of dramatic information for the biography of herself on which he was then engaged, and making new friends. Happily, the publication of her new book, The Secret Doctrine, now had an all-important effect on the future of the Theosophical Society, for it was read by a brilliant woman who was to become the Society's inspiration and expand its activities throughout the world. This was Mrs. Annie Besant, who immediately adopted the tenets and teachings of Madame Blavatsky. The two women became inseparable, but for HPB, life was nearing its end. Annie Besant was obliged to travel abroad, and at once HPB declined in health. She had been an invalid for some years, but suddenly the energy and courage which had sustained her obese and diseased body drained away. She died in the arms of her friends on the 8th of May, 1891. Whether Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was the fraud her enemies claimed, or whether she was genuinely able to control psychic phenomena and command spirits, has never been proved. What is certain is that she was a woman of remarkable mesmeric powers, which, combined with boundless enthusiasm, wide occult knowledge, and a true belief in the possibility of attaining an understanding of the afterlife, converted many intelligent people to her philosophy. Wow, that was a super long chapter. Holy shnikes. Hello, beautiful Sister Sandra. I'm going to take a moment, take a drink, and a pull off of my vape pen here. So bear with me. Very nice. Alrighty then. So this next one is known as Miracle Making in Benares. So Benares, or Varanasi, as it is widely known today, is reputed to be one of the most ancient cities in the world. I have someone calling in, and I don't know why. Hold on a second. Let's see who it is. Who could it be? Hello?
Hello.
Hello. Who am I speaking with?
Hi, I was just calling. I thought the radio show was on for Chris Garcia.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
it on?
That was last night.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So we'll have him on this coming month. I believe he's going to be on the 4th or the 11th. But yeah, it was a really good show. I'm sorry you missed it.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm sorry.
No worries. I hope you have a good night.
All right. Thank you. You too.
All right. Nighty night. Love and light. Aw. Yeah, we originally had it scheduled for tonight, but then Chris was double booked, so we rescheduled it for last night, so that might have confused some people. Oh, now I feel bad. But she'll be able to call in next weekend or next month. Alrighty. So Benares, or Varanasi, as it is widely known today, is that Varanasi? Yeah. Is reputed to be one of the most ancient cities in the world. It is located fairly centrally in northern India on the river Ganges, and is regarded as the holiest of the 7 Hindu sacred cities. It has survived the ravages of time and invaders. In 1194, it was sacked by Muslims, most of the temples being razed to the ground and replaced by mosques, and was ceded to the British, ceded to the British in 1775. Each year, 1 million or more pilgrims visit the city to bathe in the holy water of the Ganges, and since it is believed that those who die in Benares proceed direct to heaven, the burning ghats on the river, where the dead are cremated, are kept busy. I heard, even though they still do their, sacred bathing and cremation, thrown out in the river and burning of bodies, so on and so forth, that river is super polluted, but people still go there and do their thing. I would be scared. So Paul Brunton's first reaction on entering India's holiest city was that it possessed a most unholy smell. This arose from the fact that the roads were paved with a mixture of cow dung and earth, added to which an old moat surrounding the city had been used for generations as a refuse damp and drain. Nevertheless, it was a sacred city and therefore an inevitable target for Brunton's questing mind, which was not concerned with tourism, but with the higher realms of mysticism and philosophy. Brunton's extensive wanderings throughout the East are recorded in his books, which he started to write during the 30s. At that time, he was a relatively young man, armed with a knowledge of shorthand, a stock of notebooks, and a folding Kodak camera. In addition to his travel books, however, he also wrote 2 books on mysticism and yoga, The Secret Path and The Quest for the Overself, which, though aimed at the Western reader, proved to be a remarkable distillation of the essence of Oriental mysticism, both in practical and philosophical terms. They underline Brunton's true motivation as a man in search of esoteric knowledge, prepared to travel thousands of miles to find it, record it, analyze it, and finally present it in an intelligible and logical form to the Western mind. To what end? Perhaps in the response to some inner compulsion which certainly, on the evidence available, dominated many years of his active life. So it was not by accident that Brunton came to the holy city of Benares. In his pocket was a piece of paper bearing the name and address of a yogi miracle worker, one of whose disciples he had previously met in Bombay. The name of the yogi was Vishuddhananda. Yeah. As he had no formal letter of introduction, Brunton could not know what kind of reception to expect, but he was determined to meet his man if at all possible. To locate the address, he explored the narrow winding streets of Benares on foot, which was not without its hazards, as he was aware of a generally hostile attitude towards a lone European wandering through the holy city. Indeed, on one occasion, a threat to shoot him was hissed behind his back, though on turning around, he saw no sign of a fanatical face in the crowded street. Soon he came to a district where the houses were larger and more prosperous in appearance. With spacious and well-kept compounds, it was here that he eventually found his destination, a gate with the name Vishuddhananda inscribed on one of the posts. To arrive at the house was one thing, to enter it another. The veranda was guarded by a young man who created the impression, perhaps deliberately, of uncomprehending stupidity. Brunton's request to see the yogi teacher got him nowhere. The young guardian merely shook his head. No such person was known there. Brunton's impression was that perhaps the young man genuinely believed that no European could possibly have any business with his yogi master, and that the address he had been given was an error. Determined not to be put off and relying on Hindu hospitality, Brunton brushed aside all objections and simply walked into the house, leaving the young man at his post on the veranda. In one of the inner rooms, he came upon his objective, a bearded old man of vulnerable appearance reclining upon a couch, while around him on the floor squatted a group of well-dressed Indians. Their surprise at Brunton's unexpected and unannounced intrusion can well be imagined. Brunton made the conventional salutation, saying, with palms touching, "Peace, master," and set out to explain his presence. He was, he explained, a writer and a student of Indian native philosophy and wisdom, and well understood that the holy teachers never made public exhibition of their powers. Nevertheless, in view of his deep interest in their ancient wisdom, he begged indulgence to be treated as an exception. The students, squatting on the floor, stared in astonishment at each other and then at their teacher. Vishuddhananda, the latter, a man of over 70, had large, deeply pouched eyes and a short nose above his long gray beard. Around his neck hung a sacred thread of a Brahmin. His eyes, not unexpectedly, fixed coldly upon the European visitor. Brunton recorded a strange force pervading the room which made him feel uneasy. At length, Vishuddhananda announced in Bengali via disciple that no audience could be granted unless Brunton were accompanied by Pandit Kavir, the principal of the government Sanskrit college, to act as interpreter. The Pandit was a long-standing disciple of the yogi and had a perfect command of English. An appointment was made for 4 o'clock the following afternoon. The next step, after Brunton had expressed his thanks and made his departure, was to find Pandit Kavir, but this time he hired a passing carriage to take him to the Sanskrit college. The principal had gone home. Undeterred, he drove on for another half-hour to a tall ancient house where the Pandit lived, and this time he was lucky. He found his man sitting on the floor of a top room, surrounded by books and documents. A Brahmin, in appearance, with a refined, scholarly face of light complexion, Brunton explained his mission, and after some hesitation, the Pandit agreed on the next day's appointment. Having arranged his program satisfactorily, Brunton could now relax for a while. He took a carriage to the bank of the Ganges and wandered along the terraced stone steps which had been built originally for the benefit of the bathing pilgrims, but now, after many centuries of use, these steps were worn and uneven. Even so, pilgrims and priests swarmed everywhere. His chief impression was one of untidiness and irregularity. In his own words, temples stumble into the water, glistening domes are neighbors to squat square decorated places which rise to varying heights, while the whole hodgepodge of buildings mingles the ancient and modern indiscriminately. So on that note, you guys, we are going to go to our first musical break. On this break, we have Miss Tracy Cruz with Flowers and Candy. She's also going to be singing Joyful Rain. And then we have Miss Michaelin Hay with Pins and Needles. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this musical break.
When I met you, my life changed. Your love rained all over me. It was blissful, so special, essential. Life poetry, true beauty. We created, we made it. Reality, pure affection with expression. A connection was meant to be. You make me feel so good inside, like therapy for my mind. You make me feel so good inside. It was like flowers and candy, understanding how you're standing really must be love. I'm talking true, I'm talking real, and I felt it in my heart. It was like flowers and candy, understanding how you're standing really must be love. I'm talking true, I'm talking real, and I felt it in my heart and soul. You make me feel so good inside. You make me feel so good inside.
Now what is this that's happening? I don't even know you anymore. Oh, yeah. Changes moving through every day. Yeah. And I don't even know what we're fighting for.
Our bright days turn to sleepless nights. Our loving ways have turned to endless fights, and we can't seem to compromise. We try so hard to make things right. Yesterday, will erase all the turns. Can't we turn back? Hands on side. You are my life.
Now what is really happening?
on pins and needles, every word through a microscope. You keep stomping down on the ground while I've been stuck on this tightrope. I just wanna say what I wanna say without your sentence. I'm not willing to do the time when I'm innocent, and I'm innocent. Talking on pins and needles. Talking on pins and needles. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. Walked on my share of thin ice with your blowtorch at my feet. You won't ever see me beg, so take this tongue off your leash. I'm gonna say what I wanna say, don't need permission. Interpret it how you want, it's my decision. Talking on pins and needles. Talking on pins and needles. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. Dancing on shattered glass, kicking the pieces all around. My safety has been broken, this is now a hunting ground. Talking on pins and needles. Talking on pins and needles. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna
your love has affected me. Everything you do makes me smile.
Welcome back, Wapham crew. Tonight we're having story time with me, TessaTNT, and I've been reading from a book that I inherited from my grandpa. It's part of his paranormal collection, and it's 50 Strange Stories of the Supernatural, and the story we're on right now is Miracle Making in Benares. So, let us continue, shall we? The next day, as arranged, Pundit Kavirj and Brunton arrived at Vishadhanananda's house at exactly 4 o'clock. This time, there was no problem about entering. The teacher was in his room as before, surrounded by about 6 other disciples, and Brunton was invited to squat down a few feet away from the couch upon which he lay. Vishadhanananda immediately asked Brunton if he wished to see one of his wonders, and when Brunton, pleased and surprised, deferentially said, "If the master wishes to grant this favor," he was asked for a handkerchief, preferably a silk one. "I will create for you any scent you wish," said Vishadhananda, using only a lens and the rays of the sun. Fortunately, Brunton did have a silk handkerchief, which he handed to the teacher, who then produced a small lens with which he intended to concentrate the sun's rays. At that time of day, the sun was not shining directly into the sheltered room, but Vishadhananda overcame the problem by sending a disciple out into the courtyard with a small mirror, by the means of which he reflected the sun's rays into the room. Now, we're just going to call him V, okay? Yay, I'm so glad you like the stories, Dennis. So now V said, "I will create a scent for you out of the air. You have only to choose which." Brunton asked for a white jasmine, a strong and familiar scent. The teacher then picked up the handkerchief in one hand, held the burning lens above it, and for about 2 seconds a brilliant spot of sunlight glowed on the silk. When he handed the handkerchief back to Brunton, it smelt as though it had been drenched in the fragrant scent of white jasmine. Brunton looked carefully at the handkerchief. There was no sign of moisture or of any stain to indicate that the liquid might have been dropped on it, nor any scorching of the fibers from the lens. Brunton's bewilderment was so apparent that V offered to repeat the demonstration, and on the second occasion, Brunton chose the scent of attar of roses. This time, he watched carefully every move that the master made, closely examining his hands and his spotless white robe, but could see nothing that was not perfectly straightforward. The procedure was repeated using not perfectly straightforward. Was repeated using another corner of the handkerchief, which this time smelt strongly of attar roses. Mystified, Brunton begged him to repeat the feat yet again, and V obligingly produced the scent of violets, while Brunton watched as carefully and with as little result as before, while in the contrast to Brunton's eagerness and astonishment, the teacher remained imperturbable. To him, this was an everyday event of no particular remark. "Now I shall create the scent," he told Brunton, "of a flower which grows only in Tibet." Once more, V concentrated the sunlight on the fourth corner of the handkerchief and then handed it to Brunton. This time the subtle scent was one which he failed to recognize. Still filled with doubt, Brunton put the handkerchief back in his pocket, but he witnessed a true wonder. Or had V somehow contrived to hide the perfumes in the folds of his robe? This explanation was hardly possible, for it would have meant that the master would have to carry upon him a stock as large as that of a Paris perfumier, to allow for the random choice that Brunton might make. Moreover, during the whole procedure, his hands had always remained in view. Brunton looked carefully at the lens, but it was an ordinary magnifying glass set in a wire frame with a wire handle of the kind Brunton himself had used as a child. There was nothing in the least suspicious about it, and Brunton had noticed that the disciples, all of whom had been told were men of good reputation and education, showed no sign of assuming that the master's recent demonstration had been anything but genuine magic. The only possibility left was that Brunton had somehow been hypnotized. But when he got back to his quarters later on, he showed the handkerchief to 3 other people, each one of whom confirmed that it bore strong traces of the various scents. As he rose to take his leave, V told Brunton that he would like to show him another marvel, but it required the full light of the sun. However, if Brunton would come again at midday later on in the week, V would show him a feat that he rarely performed, that of restoring life to the dead. Naturally, Brunton accepted eagerly, but with some skepticism. Raising the dead was a rather different matter to producing scents from the air, and he felt sure that some trickery would be involved. On the appointed day, Brunton returned to the house of the yogi, again in the company of Pundit Kavirj, explaining that he can only perform this marvel on small animals and then only restore them to life temporarily. V told one of his disciples to strangle a sparrow. The bird was then left for an hour to assure that it was indeed dead. Brunton examined it closely. The small bundle of feathers was stiff and cold, the eyes staring. He could detect no sign of life whatever. At the end of the hour, the master took his magnifying glass and concentrated the rays of the sun, now at its noonday height, onto one of the eyes of the bird. Motionless, V sat hunched over the bird, his large brilliant eyes fixed unwinkingly on it, his face betraying no emotion. After a few minutes, V suddenly began a weird crooning chant in a language unknown to Brunton. A few moments later, the bird's legs began to twitch. The feathers fluttered slightly, and within a few minutes the sparrow was on its feet, hopping a little uncertainly around the floor. However, it soon gathered enough strength to spread its wings, and for half an hour it flew around the room, occasionally finding somewhere to perch. Brunton was speechless with astonishment. So incredible seemed the incident that he was obliged to make a real effort of will to pull his wits together and assure himself that what was happening was real and not some strange dream or hallucination. The atmosphere was tense, but as he searched the faces of the pundit and of the yogi's disciples, Brunton saw nothing but absorbed interest as they watched the little bird. Suddenly, the spell was broken. Without warning, the bird fell from the air and dropped to the floor, where it lay without moving. Once again, Brunton carefully examined it, and once again, it was obviously quite dead. Brunton told Pundit Kavirj to ask the master whether he could have kept the bird alive any longer. V replied that with further experiment he hoped to do greater things, but that was the most he could do at present. Kavirj added independently that what Brunton had already seen should satisfy him. He could not expect the master to continue to perform marvels as though he were a street magician, but he added that V could produce grapes and sweetmeats from the air, and restore a faded flower to full bloom. Brunton then asked V the story of his life and learned he had been born in Bengal. At the age of 13, he was bitten by a poisonous insect, which made him so ill that his mother despaired of his life and took him down to the banks of the Ganges to die. Watched by relations who had come to observe the funeral rites, his mother lowered the body of her son into the water. But the holy river refused to receive the dying boy. As he was lowered into the water, it receded, and as he was raised up, it rose again in its former level. The yogi sitting nearby observed this and came over to the boy's family. He predicted that the child was intended to live. His life was reserved for great things, and he would become a famous yogi himself. Then he rubbed some herbs on the poison wound and told the parents to take the child home. 7 days later, the yogi arrived to tell the parents that their son was completely cured. This was true, but in that week an entire personality and character of the child had changed. He was no longer content to remain at home with his family, but wished instead to become a wandering yogi. When he was eventually given permission to leave, he went in search of the adepts of yoga and made his way to Tibet. There among the hermits, he lived in the caves of the snow-covered windswept mountains. He searched for the master who, according to the beliefs of aspirant to the mysteries of yoga, must become his personal teacher. What the crack? He returned disappointed to his home, but his determination remained, and on a second visit to southern Tibet, he at last found the right man. He was V. Vishadhananda said, 1,200 years old, and he said it as calmly as he had said 50, and he had initiated V into the principles of yoga, body control, and into the art of what he called solar science. V continued his training in the bleak mountains for 12 years and was then sent back to India where, in due course, he himself became a teacher of yoga in Puri, in the Bay of Bengal, where he still had a large house. Among his principals, all high-class Hindus were rich merchants and landowners, government officials, and even Raja. "How do you perform the wonders that you have shown me?" asked Brunton. The yogi folded his plump hands. "What you have been shown," he said, "is not the result of yoga practice. It is the knowledge of solar science. Yoga is the development of willpower and mental concentration. But solar science is merely a collection of secrets, and no special training is needed to make use of them. It can be studied just as any of the Western material sciences can be studied. It is nothing new and was well known to the great yogis of ancient times. Now, except for a rare few, the knowledge has almost been lost to this country. There are life-giving elements in the sun's rays, and if you knew how to select and separate those elements, you too could do wonders. There are etheric forces in sunlight which can be controlled and which give a magic power." Brunton asked V if he were teaching these secrets to his disciples, and was told that certain of the disciples would be chosen then when they were ready, and the secrets given to them would be theirs alone. He was taken to see the laboratory which he had built for the purpose of study, demonstration, and experiment. It was a modern red brick building, several stories high, its windows still awaiting the huge sheets of glass, red, blue, green, yellow, and clear, through which the sunlight could be reflected. Brunton returned to sit before the master, brooding on the fact that, as a Westerner, he would never understand the mysteries of Oriental magic. As though he had read Brunton's thoughts, V said, "I cannot initiate you as my pupil unless I secure permission beforehand from the Tibetan master. That is a condition under which I have to work." Although he was sure that such a request would not be granted, Brunton asked how V could communicate with his master if he were in Tibet. We are in perfect touch upon the inner planes, replied V, and once again Brunton was aware that he had not understood the yogi's meaning. Unless you practice yoga, you cannot obtain enlightenment, the teacher said. And when you are ready, you will be able to find a teacher, if not in the flesh, in the inward eye of the seeker. Meanwhile, he told Brunton how he could begin to practice the yoga of body control by showing him the lotus position, which is, to Europeans, such a contortion. Just as every human being both thinks and acts, so there must be training for both sides of our nature, said V. The body acts on the mind, and the mind interacts on the body. They cannot be separated in practical development. He fell silent, and Brunton became aware that, suddenly, the yogi had had enough. It was time for him to leave. But there was one last, irresistible question. Have you discovered whether there is any purpose, any goal in life? The pupils smiled at Brunton's simplicity. Only a Westerner would ask such a question, and the teacher did not even bother to answer. It was Kvierge who finally explained, Certainly there is a purpose. We have to attain spiritual perfection, to unite with God. Brunton strolled home through the teeming narrow alleys of the city and paused to sit for a while beside the holy river, pondering upon what he had heard and seen. How could V have produced the sense? He had heard of 2 others in the western India who had been able to do so, but both were now dead. And was the concentration of sunlight merely a blind for something else? How had he revived the dead bird? And what could explain the longevity of some yogis? The only Indian philosophy that the universe is but phantom-like in its real nature drifted into Branton's mind. Reality seemed distant, no experience too strange, but as he eventually made his way back to his quarters in the everyday world, it was with the knowledge that he would never truly comprehend the secrets of this ancient land. This next story is called The Indian Rope Trick. Anyone, a retired Indian Army officer said to me once, who has lived in India for 20 years as I have, and who can still claim that he does not believe in magic, is either a fool or a liar. For India is a land steeped in magic as ancient as any that can be found in the world. It is the birthplace of mysteries which have attracted seekers after truth from all over the globe. It is also the birthplace of yoga, whose followers range from the housewives of suburbia to the high priests of knowledge. The marvels that some of these men of magic are reputed to have performed are truly remarkable. But there is one which is perhaps the most baffling of all, not only in its actual performance, but also in the fact that, while it is said to have been seen in many places by thousands of people, including such eminent men as Beebe, the naturalist, and Gorky, the novelist, there are others who have been unable to find anyone who can perform it, and who say it does not exist or is merely a hallucination. It is, of course, the famous Indian rope trick. A gruesome and extraordinary feat which has not only been performed and written about for centuries, but which has also been the subject of many heated arguments. Let us begin, however, by describing the trick. For this, we shall use the eyewitness account of Sheikh Abdullah Muhammad, a native of Tangier and one of the earliest travelers through the Orient. In the 14th century, he was the guest of the ruling Khan in Hangzhou, and in his book of travels, Ibn Battuta, he says that one evening he was guest of honor at a sumptuous banquet, which was attended by many Mohammedan merchants and princes. The banquet took place in one of the many courts of the Khan's palace, where fountains and scented plants cooled the air, and where, as usual, troops of dancers and jugglers entertained the guests to a succession of tableaux, dances, aerobatics, juggling feats, and magical delights. As the day drew towards evening, one of the jugglers, a heavily built, surly-looking fellow, stepped into the center of the courtyard. The music stopped, and the other entertainers backed away, leaving him alone. Like the other members of the troupe, he wore a loose-fitting shirt and wide, baggy trousers, which would not impede his movements. Unlike the others, he carried over his shoulder the most magnificent cloak Sheikh Abdu had ever seen. It was made of thousands of iridescent feathers, threads of silver and gold, and brilliant gems. It shimmered like the throat of a great bird, flickering with turquoise, blue, purple, and liquid red that flowed like volcanic fire along its folds. Around its edges ran a border of huge yellow-green eyes like those in a peacock's tail. In his hand, this imposing man held a wooden ball. A strip of leather, woven like a rope, hung out of a hole in the sphere. He stretched his arms out wide, holding the ball at arm's length, and began to turn faster and faster. His cloak, now spread out upon the air, seemed a sun-lighted whirlpool of brilliant water spiraling inwards to the juggler's dark head at its center. Faster and faster he whirled, and then suddenly stopped, and, with a quick twist of his body, sent the wooden ball soaring into the sky. Whether the sphere flew so high as to go out of sight, or just disappeared into thin air, the sheik could not say, but it vanished in a twinkling of an eye. The magician, however, was still holding the leather rope, which had unwound from inside the ball, and now rose vertically into the blue sky. How high it went, it was impossible to say. There seemed no reason to doubt that it was still attached to the invisible wooden ball and in some way suspended. The juggler paused, while the sheik marveled at what he had seen so far. Then he turned slowly and searched the crowd of entertainers lining the sides of the court. All cowered before his gaze, save for one small boy, who burst from the crowd and began running for an archway. The juggler pointed, and a dozen arms stretched out to trap the boy, who was brought struggling to the magician. Suddenly his struggles ceased, and, seeming to accept his fate, he walked quietly and with resignation up to the leather rope. The juggler pointed to the sky, and the boy began to climb. He was not a strong boy. The first few feet of the climb obviously cost him a great effort, and it took him quite a few minutes to reach the height of the palace's domed roofs. Then he seemed to lose all weight and to climb at an incredible speed. His size diminished at every second until, in no time at all, he was out of sight. For a while there was silence. The crowd stared upwards, and the magician waited, apparently expecting something. Then he began to show signs of growing impatience. He tugged at the leather thong several times, and then nothing happened. He called. There was no answer, and he shouted again and again. With each moment that passed, he became more irate. Finally, in a terrifying rage, he threw off his cloak, unsheathed a curved sword which was lying nearby, gripped the sword in his teeth, and began to climb the rope. The sheik was astounded. In not more than 2 or 3 seconds, the magician also was lost in sight. So fast did he climb. For a few minutes there was silence, the crowd gazing upwards towards the point where the leather rope disappeared in the arch of the sky. Suddenly, the air above the palace courtyard was rent with an anguished screams. The sheik felt his blood freeze. They were high-pitched screams of a young boy in terror of his life. The sheik leapt up, spurred by the instinct to save the child, and ran to the foot of the rope. But there was nothing to be seen. The thin, twisted rope stretched upwards to disappear into the heavens, and yet terrible screams continued. Suddenly, they stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and then a tiny dot appeared in the sky, falling rapidly, growing larger. It thumped to the earth at the foot of the leather rope before the sheik. The hand and forearm of a young boy, still bleeding where it had been viciously hacked from the body. The sheik retreated, horrified, but more dots were appearing in the sky, the boy's other arm and part of his thigh. Then a hail of pieces fell. A mutilated foot, a leg cut short below the knee, a part of the foot with the toes still attached, the poor skinny torso chopped into quarters, eventually with a force that spattered the sheik with blood, the head of the boy, terror written across his face, landed on the loathsome pile. The sheik fell to his knees, weeping, and as he knelt he saw the magician, black and evil against the sky, slithering down the leather rope, using it only to break his fall as he landed beside his victim. Quickly, the magician threw his splendid coat over the remains. In what seemed a devilish dance of triumph, he jumped repeatedly upon the dismembered body. Finally, suddenly, exhausted by his efforts, he turned, picked up his bloody sword, slowly wiped it, and put it back in its scabbard. Then, with all the aplomb of a dancer, he rolled his cloak up from the ground, spun it twice around his head, and allowed it to drop shimmering upon his shoulders. In the same instant, the boy appeared at the magician's right hand, caught the wooden ball as it fell from the sky, and unconcernedly began winding in the rope. The sad pile of butchered limbs had vanished. At this point, the sheik believes he fainted, for when he came to, other guests were supporting him and the Khan was giving him water. Everyone was astonished by his description of what had happened. They assured him that they had seen no rope, no boy climbing into the sky, no dismemberment, nothing more than an athletic dance and an acrobatic act performed by a man in a cloak and a young boy. What, in fact, had happened? Had Sheik really seen the rope trick, or had he been in some sort of trance or subject of hypnotic suggestion? Why had he been the only one out of all the guests to have seen what he believed had taken place? These same questions can be asked of practically every account of the Indian rope trick. The descriptions are often incoherent, vague, and without supporting evidence. The witnesses have admitted that they did not later discuss it with anyone else or even mention it to those close to them. The accounts are so consistently strange and yet have been so persistently repeated over the centuries that in 1934, an extensive investigation was made by the Occult Committee of the Magic Circle, whose president at that time was Lord Ampthill, once Viceroy of India. The committee decided, after taking the evidence of a great many people, that there could be no such thing as an Indian rope trick. There were two main reasons for this. The first being that the accounts were all vague, unsubstantiated, and unacceptable. The second reason was that they believed that to simulate the Indian rope trick, the apparatus needed to be so expensive as to be outside the reach of an average poor Indian. Moreover, the complexity of the apparatus required would make it impossible for the illusion to be created with little organization in any convenient spot, which was how most of the accounts described it. Therefore, the committee, having ruled out real magic and having decided to hypnotize or drugs could not account for the reports, decided that the Indian rope trick did not exist and that the people who said they had seen it were not telling the whole truth. However, the report of the committee's deliberations gave rise to a long correspondence in The Listener, and induced the Magic Circle to offer a reward of 500 guineas, a considerable sum in 1934, to anyone who could perform the Indian rope trick. This brought to anyone who could perform the Indian rope trick, This brought forth a juggler named Karachi, whose claims interested Harry Price, then honorary secretary of the University of London Council of Psychical Research, who invited Karachi to London to perform the trick. Karachi, however, rejected the site chosen for him, a Hampstead garden, and said he preferred to work in the wide open space. Karachi, whose real name was Arthur Claude Derby, was allowed to choose his own site, a field near Wheathampstead in Hertfordshire, and allowed access to the site for several days to prepare the trick. The trick was eventually performed on the 7th of January 1935, and a report with photographs was published in The Listener of January 16th, 1935. The team of witnesses, having fortified themselves against the winter cold in a local pub, gathered in the muddy English field on a drizzly day to watch the famous trick being performed by an Englishman and his son with blackening on their faces. As a warming-up session, Karachi performed a few balancing acts before the major illusion began. Karachi threw a rope to his witnesses, an ordinary rope about 6 feet long. Karachi then took the rope behind a multicolored cloth of velvet set up as a screen. The rope appeared to rise from behind the cloth as if it were pushed up from below. Quite stiff, the rope, if it was the rope, ascended to a height of 6 feet, then slowly sank back down below the cloth. Karachi then threw another, ordinary, loosely woven rope to his audience. The second rope was passed back and placed beneath the cloth. Once more, an end appeared and edged upwards, this time a height of 8 feet. At this point, Karachi stopped and ordered his son to climb it. Quickly, the boy did so. Then he came down again, and that was the end of the demonstration. In the bar of the local pub, Karachi offered to explain how the trick was done, but Harry Price wasn't interested. He also claimed that he knew how to make the boy disappear and undergo all the traditional misfortunes, but that would take a great deal of preparation. The demonstration had been filmed, but, not surprisingly, when the account of the event... Hold on. When the account of the event and the film were submitted to the occult committee, it refused to award the 500 guinea prize. In reply, Karachi issued a challenge to the committee offering to perform the trick under a set of heavy and very reasonable conditions chosen by himself. The challenge, however, was never taken up. 20 years later, another seeker after truth, a determined and adventurous young journalist named John Keel, who thought he had learned the secret, had as little success with his demonstration. His specialty, as he says in his book Fadu, is magic, the forbidden arts, and his favorite hunting grounds are the hills of Africa and the plains of India. In pursuit of thirst for knowledge, Keel found himself in Secunderabad, where he learned of a faith healer who had some unique talents. Keel set out to find this man, following some rather sketchy directions, and with no success. Finally, at the top of the hill, he sat down to rest in a small white-domed structure equipped with benches for the convenience of climbers. The only other person there was an old man. To his surprise, the man, dressed in a dhoti and with a small cap on his head, addressed him by name. He appeared to know many things about Keel, and even gave him advice about a story he had been working on the night before, and which wasn't going well. Keel was astonished, but the old man realized also skeptical. Amused, he told Keel that many things he believed impossible were possible, and that he could, for example, tell him how the Indian rope trick was performed. At the same time, however, he said that Keel had greater inner resources which he had not yet discovered, and that if he reached for these untapped resources, he would find the answers to what he was looking for and more besides. The old man would say no more, nor allow Keel to accompany him when he decided to go home. He left Keel dazed with the realization that he had at last learned the secret of the great rope trick that had for so long baffled the Western world, and according to Keel, it is as simple as this. The secret does not lie in the ground or in the rope, but in the air. Wires hold the rope up. In ancient times, magicians used a length of thin, strong line made from black hairs woven together. Remember, this trick was introduced when invisible wires, now a standard magician's gimmick, were completely unknown, and it was always performed at dusk, at the conclusion of the juggler's performance, because of the hair ropes weren't totally invisible. But how were the ropes supported? Kill maintains that the rope trick was actually done in mountainous regions, never in a desert country, in a valley between two hills or rocky knolls. The invisible wire, he says, was stretched from the summit of one hill across the valley to the summit of the other hill. With higher hills in the background, even ordinary wire was invisible. With the added advantages of dusk, there was little chance that the wire could be seen, because it's human nature to think the rope support must be vertical, not horizontal. There is also a simple explanation for those cases where the boy is reported to have climbed into the sky until he disappears from view. Torches or lanterns, Kill says, made the spectators night blind when they look up into the dark sky. The rope was lifted up to the suspension wire in the following way. A thinner rope or thread was previously dangled over the wire, with one end trailing to a concealed spot where an assistant could pull it. A small hook at the other end hung near the magician. The rope itself was unprepared except for the wooden ball, which had two purposes. It gave weight to the end of the rope to make it easier to throw it up, and it had holes in it in which the hooks could be inserted. Thus, at the beginning of the trick, the magician would throw the rope up once or twice and allow it to fall back inert, until finally he would connect the hook on the end of the fine ascension wire to one of the holes in the ball. The next time he threw the ball up, the assistant had only to haul on the thread, and the rope would begin to rise until it reached the wire. The magician would then call his boy and order him to climb. The rope, held by the ascension wire, would bear the weight of the small boy, and when he reached the top, he would pull a hook from his pocket and fasten the ball more securely to the wire so that it would bear the magician's weight. When the magician also reached the top of the rope, he would pull from various parts of his clothing pieces of a fleshy, butchered animal, usually a large monkey, wrapped in cloth similar to that which the boy was wearing. He would drop these one at a time while the boy screamed agonizingly until finally a head, wrapped in a turban, would strike the ground. While assistants fussed around below, assembling the parts into a large basket, the magician would hurry the boy into a special harness he wore inside his own baggy clothes, and then slide down the rope. It was easy enough then for the boy to emerge from the master's clothing while the attention of the audience was directed to something else, and reappear whole and in one piece while the bloody bits of body were hidden underneath a cloak or spirited away by assistants. If you read this account of the secret in connection with the tale told by Sheikh Abu, you will see that many things can be explained by it. The wires could have been stretched from wall to wall of the courtyard, the iridescent cloak could have been hidden much and distracted considerably, and the dismembered corpse is not so implausible. On the other hand, Sheikh Abu states that the performance took place after all the other jugglers and dancers, but he also says the sky was blue, and one must assume therefore that it was not dusk, though doubtful. Light appears to be a prerequisite of the trip. However, this all explains quite a lot, very satisfactorily, and John Keel decided to give his own demonstration of the trick in New Delhi, intending to perform just a part of it. He sent out invitations, bought a long rope, and found an intelligent boy to act as his assistant. A grove of trees on a golf course close to the picturesque old temple provided an ideal spot, and Keel rigged a network of black threads across the clearing in such a way that the rope would rise about 50 feet into the air. He could not find a boy to climb it, but he thought it would be a convincing demonstration. As usual, the weather was sunny and cloudless on the day of the demonstration, and about 50 reporters turned up to watch the show. And then, At the last minute, a storm blew up. A high wind rose and a monsoon cloudburst crashed around them. It was the first and last storm Keel experienced during his entire stay in New Delhi, and in a few minutes it was all over, but it had wrecked the careful setup. The threads were tangled in the bushes, and the boy had fled from his hiding place. Distraught, the nervous Keel fumbled about with the threads and managed to get the rope about 4 feet off the ground. Eventually, he gave up. The newspaper reports, he says, were all very kind and fair. Their friendliness and concern helped soothe the embarrassment and pain of his failure. The famous trick has still not been performed successfully in front of an audience, even though the secret has now been published. The magic circle's offer remains unclaimed, and the mystery stays unsolved. Apparently, it was a freak storm that ruined Keel's demonstration. Or was it India? Jealousy guarding her ancient secrets? This next story that we're going to get into shortly before our second music break is The Princess and the Pekingese. For years, the snub-nosed, long-haired, and some might say grotesque little animal, the Pekingese, was the royal dog of China, hence, of course, its name, for it was bred in the royal kennels of Peking, and only the emperor was allowed to possess such a beast. It was indeed the greatest of honors when the emperor, near the middle of the 16th century, decided to send not just one Pekingese, but 2 to England's Queen Elizabeth I. It would be a mark of friendship and respect. Accordingly, one of the finest dogs and one of the finest bitches in the royal Peking kennel were selected. Then came the complicated arrangement whereby these 2 would make their journey to the distant land of England by land and sea. Much study was devoted to the matter, and eventually it was decided on a route. This would be by caravan across China and the steppes of Asia to the start of the maritime part of the trip. And during the journey, they would be housed in an exquisitely wrought, hand-carved ivory box. It was a large box, for in view of the length of the journey, it was likely that the English queen would get a bonus in the shape of a litter of Pekingese puppies. And no ordinary kennel maid could be sent with a gift so precious. One of the royal princesses, a beautiful almond-eyed girl of 17, was chosen to travel and supervise the feeding and cleaning of the animals. However, many of them would turn out to be. For this menial task, she had a servant, of course, but it was her responsibility to make sure the dogs all arrived clean, plump, and well in the English court. So long was the overland trip from Peking to the Black Sea that it would not have been surprising if the little Pekingese bitch had produced several litters by this time, but in fact she produced only one, of 5 fine healthy pups. And the unexpected rigors of the sea journey would make sure neither she nor her mate ever thought of such a thing again. The sumptuous craft had been built at the Black Sea port to the emperor's own design. The party embarked with delight, for now they were bidding farewell to the dust and heat of Asia, setting sail amid balmy breezes in a wide, flat, gilding vessel which gave everyone plenty of room to move around, even the well-grown pups, who would chase each other around the decks while servants cleaned their ivory cage. The trip along the Black Sea was a joy. There was sufficient wind to keep the square Chinese sails stretched tight, but insufficient to produce much more than a ripple on the bright blue water. The Bosphorus was thrilling, the Mediterranean a new world. But as the Chinese vessel approached the Pillars of Hercules, Gibraltar, the temperature dropped sharply, the wind rose, and what had been a wonderful summer cruise became dramatically and very sickeningly a hideous, stormy ordeal. By the time they had cleared the Pillars of Hercules and were headed north for the Bay of Biscay, it was very obvious that the craft on which the emperor had lavished so much loving care was quite unseaworthy in these northern western waters. When they reached the bay, their flat-bottomed, lovely ship was 3 parts wreck. The gilt and red lacquer, which had made her so beautiful when the princess and her companions embarked, had all but chipped away, or been obliterated by salt spray. One mast had snapped in 2. The huge Chinese rudder took 10 men to hold it in these seas. The Chinese captain had little trouble in persuading his princess that they must put in to a French port. Repairs would of course be possible, but somehow, said the captain, it might be wiser to charter a more suitable designed ship for the last nasty bit of water to England. Even with a new mast, the Chinese vessel would be a disgrace to the royal court of Peking. Her planned triumphal progress up the river Thames would be like an old ship's last sad journey to the breakers. If a new ship were chartered with a French crew, the Chinese crew and their captain could stay and supervise repairs, so that in a week or 2 the princess and her servants could be brought back and re-embarked for the journey home. So they put into Brest. A French ship was found, but the French captain had to be well paid for his services. For some reason he seemed most reluctant to load up the 7 little dogs with their strange demeanor. Even the beautiful princess, with her unfamiliar oriental features, seemed to fill him and his crew with dread. The captain demanded his enormous fare in advance, and even though he swiftly divided a part of it among his crew, there was angry muttering as the ship sailed. The Chinese courtiers did their best to make the princess comfortable and happy in this sturdy but utilitarian vessel. Yet it was such a terrible come-down from the stately Chinese junk they had brought from Crimea that the princess had a sense of shame mounting to panic as she realized how the Chinese emperor, greatest man on earth, would now be represented to an English queen. She hoped the queen would like her dogs. At least they were still plump, healthy, and numerous. For the first few hours out of Brest, the Atlantic Ocean behaved itself. But even during these calm hours there was a sinister and threatening attitude among the crew, who were convinced that this devilish septet of baby dragons would bring bad luck. The presence of the slant-eyed Oriental lady and her followers only reinforced their foreboding. The crossing was to be straight across the Brest to Land's End, then a cautious clinging to the English south coast until the mouth of the Thames was reached. But as ill luck would have it, they ran into a vicious storm sweeping in from the western Atlantic just as they sighted Land's End. A moment later, Land's End had vanished in an explosive sea far more terrifying than anything the princess and her party could possibly imagine. In this crisis, the French captain was quite incapable of exercising discipline or steadying the vessel as he ran to and fro, screaming hysterical instructions. The crew, ignoring him, tried to take in sail. The mast snapped just as it had done on the ornate Chinese junk, but perhaps with more justification. In a moment a vast shroud of canvas was covering the deck, muffling the screams and curses of the angry, frightened crew. The canvas was somehow got overboard, and then the princess, who understood not a word of French, or English for that matter, understood quite suddenly what design the crew of this hateful vessel had on her, her courtiers, and above all, her 7 beautiful Pekingese. She let out a scream which momentarily silenced the wind as 2 burly crew members picked up the ivory box with its precious little dogs and flung it into the boiling sea. Oh my goodness. We're gonna go to our second musical break on that note. I'm gonna keep you guys on the end of your chairs till we get back to finish entertaining and stimulating your earballs with these amazing stories. Alright, so on this music break, we have Miss Tracy Cruz with Electricity and Emotional Love. We also have Miss Michaela Hay with Mirror and Devil You Know. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this musical break.
Your love empowers me. It gives me the energy to move beyond my capabilities. There is no limit to what your love can do.
spiraling out of control, was touch and go, went a little far. You taught me how to turn a blind eye. I showed you how to keep my shoulder cold. No one walked away without a scar. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through this rippled mirror. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through this rippled mirror. Try to erase the ink that's left upon my chest. I'll attest, I don't really wanna forget to forget. You taught me how to turn a blind eye. I showed you how to keep my shoulder cold. No one walked away without a scar. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through this rippled mirror. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through this rippled mirror. You taught me how to turn a blind eye. I showed you how to keep a shoulder cold. No one walked away without a scar. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through this rippled mirror. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through this rippled mirror.
Boy, I don't know what to do. My heart is so confused. In the past, it's been put down, it's been shattered, and then I'm left without any clue to know the real truth about what I found. But with you, I found my common ground. Your love makes me emotional, 'cause you're the one that makes me feel emotional. You make me feel that love is real. 'Cause you're the one that makes me feel ever since I was young, my mom said makes you strong when
standing right in the eye of a blizzard. Your inches from a shelter, so near to warmth of a home in a chandelier, shining down its light on love, wishing you'd be closer. The curtain's nice, but what it hides is worse than sticks and stones. Before you climb the fence tonight, look through the microscope. That of the devil, you know. 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 Before you climb the fence tonight, look through the microscope. That of the devil, you know. That of the devil, you know. That of the devil, you know. That of the devil, you know.
Welcome back to We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies story time with me, TessaTNT. Happy August 1st. Happy Friendship Day, friends and family. Can you believe it's Friendship Day? And here we are, all together as friends, enjoying some actually very interesting stories. I have to say, the first one was not my favorite, but I've really actually liked the last couple ones. This one's getting a pretty nitty-gritty. We left off reading The Princess and the Pekingese, and we left off where some dirty Frenchmen had thrown these poor Pekingese into the boiling seas. And now, after they were flung into the boiling sea, the princess knew that she had no wish to live. Honor demanded that she die rather than arrive without her precious charges. Clinging perilously to a spar, she saw that her fears for her companions had been correct. 2 crewmen each picked up a Chinese girl from among the ladies in waiting and hurled them overboard. A few moments later, the only male member of her entourage, an elderly Mandarin, had been flung screaming into the water. 2 men approached her across the crazily tilted deck, and through the deluges of seawater sweeping over the side, whatever happened, she said to herself, these ruffians would never have the satisfaction of throwing a princess of the imperial court into this barbarian ocean. They advanced inexorably upon her in a fantastic form of slow motion, for the ship was pitching so that one minute they were yards below her and next yards above. She flung herself over the side. The beautiful girl disappeared almost immediately, and the baleful ship bored and corkscrewed swiftly away into the storm. Yet it was the brutish crew who felt themselves relieved of a malevolent influence, for the dragons and their keepers had been committed safely to the deep. On board the French ship, it seemed as if captain and crew had been right in their theories, for within minutes the storm died away. Within half an hour the sun was shining, the wind was a gentle zephyr, and the whole episode seemed to have been a hideous nightmare. Only the snapped mast and its missing canvas gave proof of anything untoward. As for those Orientals, had they existed at all? Yes, they had. A seaman had been quite badly bitten by one of the dogs as he allowed a grimy finger to pass between the exquisite ivory bars of the cage. He had screamed with pain as he helped fling the lot into the sea, and however much the affair might seem a bad dream, his badly lacerated finger was evidence that it had been something more real. There was no point in going on. The captain had received his huge payment in advance, and now With nothing to deliver, the only thing was to get back to France and refit. And spend the money. The ship limped home, its crew sworn to secrecy and heavily brided. It avoided Brest, changed its name with a pot of paint, and arrived in Le Havre from Scandinavian waters. The Chinese captain, still making good his own vessel, indeed he had hardly begun, learnt from England that the French ship had foundered with the loss of all on board. In some strange way, it seemed that only Chinese bodies had been found on the English coast, not too far from the Land's End, but this was probably because the arrival of English, French, and other European bodies on the treacherous coast was so common an occurrence that no one bothered to report it. The tragedy was duly reported to His Imperial Majesty in Peking. At Le Havre, where a damaged French vessel had taken refuge to be remastered after a storm in Scandinavian waters, a sailor with a damaged hand, bitten by some Salchine they had stupidly taken on as a mascot, died from his minor wound. This, at Le Havre, was not all that startling. Everyone knew that a dog bite from a mad dog, and sometimes it was hard to tell whether the thing was mad or just hungry, could be fatal. Death sometimes took place months after the bite, and it was the most horrifying death any devil could invent. The victim went screaming mad and died of thirst while refusing even the sight of water. Today we call the disease hydrophobia, which means hatred of water. Another name for it is rabies or canine madness. We do know, however, that one or more members of the crew talked about the events on the ship that fateful day. It was almost inevitable, for it is seldom a whole crew can keep a secret, and eventually the story became quite widely known in French maritime areas. No attempt, however, seems to have been made to bring the men concerned to justice. The French authorities, distracted by the convulsions of the bloody wars of religion which were racking the country at the time, were too preoccupied with the more major issues. One final 16th century episode remains, however. The news of the Chinese bodies near Land's End was provided in the first instance by the village idiot, a genial, harmless young man called Peter. He had been wandering about, as he always did, at low tide in search of shellfish or pretty stones, when he saw an ivory box half buried in the sand. Peter had never heard of ivory, but it was a very beautiful box, about the size of a coffin with bars. Inside the barred coffin were 7 dead animals. They were just about the most extraordinary thing that Peter had seen. The box was quite easy to open, even for simple Peter, and he lovingly squeezed all the little animals to get out the water, but not a one recovered. Sadly, he dragged the box and the 7 dead Pekingese away from the approaching tide. Sorry, I live next door to a LDS church, and sometimes people like to visit the parking lot. Alright, so to his even greater distress, Peter now came upon several human bodies. They were not yet bloated in death, and to Peter they were all strangely beautiful. He felt angry about the storm which had delivered yet another cargo of death to his own private seacoast. In all, Peter found 7 beautiful girls, one of them more beautiful than the rest and exquisitely bejeweled. He also found 1 old man. Peter did not touch the jewels, just dragged all the bodies up the sand so the tide would not remove them. Then he ran to the nearest fisherman's cottage. Soon there was a band of men with spades. After removing all the jewelry and some of the clothes from the Chinese bodies, the good fisher folk buried them and the strange little dogs, minus their box, in the sand just above high tide. Peter spent a long time collecting flowers, and eventually he had amassed a great armful which he placed on the huge grave. One of the fishermen had scratched his wrist on the ivory box. He wasn't quite sure how it had happened, but when the digging was over, he saw the blood oozing slowly down his hand. It was a trivial injury, and he, like a number of others, had done very well out of the day. He forgot about the scratch, which healed quite quickly. 3 months later, he was dead. At first, no one drew any connection between the scratch and the dreadful death. Then, as at Le Havre, people put 2 and 2 together. From that day on, no one would go near the stretch of rock-strewn beach. Only simple Peter, who regularly brought flowers. Memories are long in that part of the world, and for years no one but Peter would go near that stretch of the coast. In any case, it was distant, unattractive, unhospitable, but every week for years, Peter would collect his little bunch of flowers and place it near where the Chinese and their dogs were buried. Eventually, Peter, 16th century Peter, for we must not forget that these events happened 400 years ago, died. For anyone else, it would not have been just a simple death, but Peter had long been prone to epileptic fits, and the unusually nasty and frightening one he had when he frothed at the mouth for hours and then seemed to fling himself over a precipice, for that was where he died, not far from his beloved grave, went almost unremarked. Peter was little mourned and not long remembered. The years went by, lengthened to decades, to centuries. 300 years passed, and only the fishermen's tales kept the details alive, as they do today. No longer was there a virgin English queen alive, as they do today. No longer was the virgin English queen who had only just established her country as a leading power. Now there was a cantankerous widow whose subjects, long accustomed to power, claimed both west and east with a new unimportant expectation, and who was most likely to be sent anything but scorpions from China. Victoria's reign was proud and prosperous, with an ever-increasing urban population. As a result, and for those who could afford such a thing, the picnic became popular. Then, on one day, out of the 7, a family might take out cold foods and wine, beer or ginger beer to enjoy the countryside or at the seaside. The seaside had its own peculiar charm in that one could keep one's beverage, whatever it was, nice and chilly in a rock pool until one was ready to drink it. The family played cricket or rounders in bare feet on the sand, and at the end of the day, everyone was happily tired with a surfeit of salt water, if not always of sun. It was in August 1850 that one such Victorian family, a quite prosperous one, went down to the sea, to a remote area not too far from Land's End. It was Sunday and a picnic day. Their name was Carmichael, and they had been holidaying at a little village called Mousehole. The family seemed to have included mother and father, 4 young children, and grandmother. 3 of the children were girls, and the youngest was a little boy about 7, and his name was Peter. The picnic basket was large and overflowing. Its leather strap was really doing its duty as they lugged it from the pony cart to this unspoiled, unknown part of the coast. It was, in fact, not a very pretty bit of coast, but at least they would be alone. Games were duly played. Everyone, even Grandma, paddled with shoes off. Skirts or trousers were rolled discreetly up. Then came the time for lunchtime. Both wine and ginger beer had been brought, and it was all now retrieved from the rock pool where it had been cooling since the pony trap arrived at 10:30. A large meal was consumed. The drinks were finished. The grown-ups lay down in the sand, handkerchiefs over their faces against the sun, and fell happily to sleep. The 3 girls and their little brother went exploring. Half an hour, and the children were back. "Oh, but surely you can see Mother and I and your grandmother are having a nap." "Surely there must be something else to explore. Why, this is real pirate country. Who knows what you may find?" Yes, Father, and we're awfully sorry, but Peter's found this really lovely bit of coral for you, and he cut his foot with it. That's how he found it. You see, by standing on it, sort of. It's awfully pretty, and it's terribly sharp. Thus galvanized, our Victorian family sat up and took note. Tincture of iodine was produced, and a roll of quite unsuitable bandage. The iodine was painfully applied. That's quite a nasty gash, said Mr. Carmichael, almost as if you've been bitten by some animal. You weren't, were you? No, of course I wasn't. Grandmother was holding the beautiful coral which had caused the accident. Oh, it is lovely, she said, but it almost does look like a dog's tooth. In 3 months, little Peter was dead. Everyone had forgotten the episode with the coral, and rabies has always been a rare disease in England, and few doctors have seen a case. It was his grandmother, only a few hours before the little boy's agonizing death, who brought out the tooth-shaped coral. As senior member of that ill-fated outing, she had been given the pretty thing. Now vague, partly rational doubts assailed her, and with eyes staring and damp with tears, she handed it to Peter's father. Mr. Carmichael hastened to the doctor with the tooth. After all, it seemed the only way the boy could have received an infection in the past months. The doctor reached for a bulky medical book and nervously thumbed through the pages. What an extraordinary thing, he said. These are the classic symptoms of rabies, hydrophobia, and it can only be given, let's see, is usually transmitted by the bite of a rabid dog. Isn't that extraordinary? That's sad. Poor little Peter. How does that, I don't know, maybe it's a curse, because I can't see how a virus could live that long. That's pretty crazy. This next story is called A Magician in Egypt. Paul Brunton's long and extensive travels through India in search of mystical and spiritual truths were duly followed by a somewhat similar pilgrimage to Egypt. Ostensibly as a journalist, which he was, but in reality motivated by the same urge to uncover the ancient philosophies and disciplines followed by the devout and to some extent by the apparent miracle workers and fakirs. Egypt, representing the Near East rather than the Far East, possessed a different cultural background, and much of the mystical lore was linked to what we now know as ancient Egypt with its various symbolic gods. His quest, in its own way, proved successful nonetheless, and the following encounter with an adept fakir is of particular interest. So Tara Bey is described by Brunton, perhaps not without justification, as Egypt's most famous fakir. He was not, as might have been the case in India, a poor man rejecting worldly possessions and relying on charity for food. On the contrary, he was prosperous, well known in certain royal circles, and occupied a modern luxury flat of the type then springing up in European suburbs of Cairo. Nevertheless, his magical accomplishments appeared to be considerable. He was born in 1897 at Tanta in the Nile Delta. His mother died in childbirth. His father was a cope due to political problems. They went to live in Turkey, where they settled in Constantinople. The youth received a good modern education, studied medicine, and eventually qualified as a doctor. In due course, he opened a clinic in Greece, and it was there that he formed what he regarded as his most remarkable feat in allowing himself to be buried alive for no less than 28 days, despite opposition from a number of religious dignitaries who considered the feat as a menace to their religions and doctrines, but the government approved on the grounds that as Terabe was a doctor, he had the right to be buried as he wished. Visits to Serbia, Bulgaria, and Italy followed. In the latter country, he permitted tests by well-known scientists who put him in a lead coffin, which was then knelt down and submerged in a swimming bath. But after about half an hour, the police interfered and stopped the demonstration. Nevertheless, it was successful. Later in France, the experiment was repeated and extended for 24 hours. Terabe said that he was glad to undergo this test because so many critics claimed to have exposed the performance of Indian fakirs in being buried alive, and that they have secret air channels dug into the earth to enable them to continue to breathe. No doubt this did occur in the case of some pseudo-fakirs. It was for this reason that Terabe performed his feat underwater, where everything could be observed and controlled by scientists and critics alike. His fame became such that he received invitations from King Faud of Egypt, King Carol of Romania, and King Victor Emmanuel of Italy, and he also received several times at Chigi Palace by Benito Mussolini. Bruton's quest, however, lay in witnessing some of these fears for himself under controlled conditions rather than listen to historical detail, and, as usual, he was able to persuade his host to perform. Bey himself was a short, distinguished-looking man with black hair and olive skin. His face was bearded and peaceful. He could wear Arab garments or well-cut European clothes with equal elegance. His eyes had a piercing quality, with strong white irises, lending depth and mystery to the jet-black pupils. His manner was soft and gentle, and he was as courteous and polished as all the better-class Egyptians. He murmured his sentences so quietly and so humbly that no one might guess that he was a man with some of the most mysterious forces of nature under his command and control. His air of self-possession was notable, and he smoked innumerable cigarettes in the course of a day. In his luxury flat, Terabe made the following positive statement on the subject of his powers. We must begin by recognizing within ourselves the great possibilities we all possess, and until we do this, we must remain bound hand and foot to unnecessary limitations that prevent us from exercising our marvelous psychic and material powers. People, when confronted with the phenomenon which I can produce, think it some kind of conjuring or else something entirely supernatural. In both cases they are wrong. They do not seem to grasp the fact that these things are perfectly scientific, obeying the laws of nature herself. It is true that I am using psychic laws which are little understood, but nevertheless they are laws. Nothing that I do is arbitrary, supernatural, or against such laws. As for those who imagine I am a kind of stage illusionist, a conjurer, I must pity their narrow minds, their inability to envisage any higher possibility for mankind, and the limited experience which has fallen to their lot. For the actual demonstration, which took place in Terabe's flat, Brunton collected a small group of doctors and other professional men whose interest he had engaged in this heterodox subject. Excuse me. They were privileged to watch a series of astonishing, if gruesome, demonstrations which Terabe performed with an ease and swiftness that was astounding. Unfortunately, Brunton does not name or identify any of these witnesses, which is a pity in view of the dramatic events which were to follow. Tara Bey had changed his European clothes for a long robe of white linen. An Arab burnous was tied around his head with double blue and gold cords. A 5-pointed gold star, the emblem of the order into which he had been initiated, hung suspended from the neck chain. Around his waist was a golden girdle. He took with arms folded upon his chest, calmly waiting the moment to begin. On the floor were a number of objects which were minutely examined by those present. These included a table loaded with daggers, hatpins, needles, skewers, bits of glass, and on another table rested a plank studded with the points of a long, sharp nails, a block of heavy stone, a weighing machine, and a large hammer. A white fowl and a gray rabbit, both tied by the feet and lying in a basket. There were also 2 gleaming scythe blades, a pair of trestles, a long coffin, a still longer and larger box, a heap of red sand, and a pair of spades, plus a few hand towels with some cotton wool and other odds and ends. 2 young men acted as assistants in the demonstration. It began as follows. The fakir touched the back of his neck and pressed the skin just above the nape firmly with his fingers, while with the other hand he pressed the temples of his forehead. He then sucked abruptly into his mouth so that for a moment his throat was agitated. Within a minute his eyes closed and he was entranced, uttering a sudden peculiar cry, and entered a state of catalepsy so rigid that he would have fallen like a dead man if his assistants had not caught him in their arms. His body was now as stiff as a piece of wood. One of his assistants then stripped him bare to the waist, while the other fixed the scythe blades to the top of the trestle table. Tara Bey's body was then lifted onto the scythe blades, one under his shoulders and one under his ankles. At this point, a doctor present measured his pulse beat and was surprised to find that it was as high as 130, nearly double the normal. The large block of stone was then brought forward and put on the scale. It weighed 90 kilograms, or around 200 pounds, the weight of a heavily built man. The block appeared to be made of solid rock granite. The assistants placed the stone on Tara Bey's bare stomach and then struck it vigorously, blow after blow, with a blacksmith's hammer. The body remained taut and rigid, as if made of iron, until eventually the stone split into 2, which fell to the floor. The fakir was then lifted up, placed on his feet, and supported. Apparently, he was quite unconscious of what had happened and had not suffered any pain. The doctors examined him with intense interest and discovered that the scythe blade edges had not left the slightest mark on his skin, although the block of granite had produced a red mark over his abdomen. Tara Bey was then placed on the nail-studded wooden plank, where an assistant stood on him, one foot on his chest and the other on his abdomen, and jumped up and down. A physical inspection of his bare back showed not the slightest mark of penetration by the spikes. His pulse rate was now 132. He was again lifted to his feet, whereupon his eyes slowly opened and his eyeballs rolled like someone just emerged from a dream and still very far away. For the next half hour, those eyes remained uncannily fixed as, little by little, he returned to life. He made a violent effort to inhale air, opening his mouth so wide that his audience saw his tongue was curled back into his throat. After breathing for a moment, he used a finger to restore his tongue to its normal position, and now appeared to be his normal conscious self once again. However, he rested for only a minute or 2 before submitting to further tests. Doctors were asked to pierce his jaw with a pair of hat pins, which one of them promptly did, running a hat pin through each cheek, and then thick skewers were used. Tara Bey, remaining awake, fully realized what was happening. He did not seem to feel the slightest pain. Even more startling was when he allowed a doctor to plunge a dagger into his throat in front of the larynx, the point reappearing when the dagger had passed through about 1 inch of flesh. One or two of the doctors somewhat skeptically watched the pupils of his eyes to see whether they were contracting or dilating, thus perhaps indicating the use of drugs, but his eyes were quite normal. What perhaps astonished the doctors most of all was the total absence of blood on Tara Bay's skin. They experimented by cutting his face with pieces of glass and sticking needles and knives into his shoulders and chest, but always with the same bloodless result. One of the doctors asked the fakir if he could produce blood from the wounds, and immediately blood began to flow until it covered his chest, at which point he stopped it again by the mere exercise of willpower. Within a few minutes, the wounds had practically healed. Next, a flaming torch was passed up and down one of Tara Bay's legs by an assistant until the flesh could be heard to crackle in the heat, but his face remained serene and undisturbed. One of the doctors, still not satisfied about the use of a powerful pain-relieving drug, checked the heart rate and made other medical tests while the flame was being applied, but there was no sign of abnormality. After sundry other feats with needles and knives, Tara Bay then gave a demonstration of his power over animals by hypnotizing the rabbit and hen. He pressed a nerve center at the back of their necks and made a few passes with his hands, after which they became totally inert and would remain in a whatever position he placed them. When the experiment was over, they jumped up, quite alert, and none the worse for their experience. Tara Bay then informed us that his body was no longer insensitive to pain, as this period lasted only some 20 to 25 minutes after his first entrancement, and he was now completely normal. Finally came the most spectacular demonstration of the evening, that of being buried alive. This feat was carried out under stringent test conditions which did not admit the slightest doubt as to its genuineness. It began with Tara Bay predicting the exact hour and minute when he would emerge from the trance into which he would throw himself. He told his audience to give him 1.5 hours, as he would arrange his awakening for 5 minutes after that time. After the floor of the apartment had been carefully examined, the coffin was brought into the center of the room. The floor, incidentally, was composed of mosaic tiles in the Egyptian fashion and had nothing below it but the ceiling of the room underneath. The possibility of secret trapdoors or piping was dismissed, and in any case, a rug was laid across the floor on which the coffin was placed. Tara Bay then went through the same process as before, putting himself in a state of total catalepsy. Supported by the assistants, his body was then examined by the doctors, who found that both breathing and heartbeats had stopped. The body of the living corpse was now laid in the coffin, nostrils and mouth stuffed with cotton wool and completely covered by the assistants with soft red sand. The wooden lid was then fitted and nailed down. Next, the long wooden trowel was put on the carpet and the coffin lifted carefully into it. Now the trowel was filled with sand to the top, completely covering the coffin. That done, the doctors and observers settled down to 1.5 hours of waiting, satisfied that everything used in this feat had been carefully examined, that there was no possibility of fraud, and that everything had been controlled. If Tara Bay survived this test, they would be forced to pay tribute to his extraordinary powers. At the end of the allotted time period, the sand was unshoveled and thrown aside, the coffin was disinterred and the lid opened. There beneath the remaining sand lay the body of Fakir, as stiff as a corpse, his skin now dull gray color. He was taken out of the coffin, whereupon the rigidity eased and he was placed in a chair. After a few minutes there were signs of quiet breathing and his eyelids flickered. Gradually, the body became reanimated until after about 10 minutes he was his normal self once more and was able to sit and talk about his strange experience. Thus, my sleep was so profound that I know nothing of what you have done to me. I recall only that I closed my eyes in this room and that by the mysterious process of post-suggestion, I have awakened in this room again at the exact moment I set myself. Brunton's feelings as he finally left the apartment contained the sentiment, ironic in the retrospect, that the tottering figure of materialism would be brought to the execution block before the end of this century. A few days later, Brunton was to visit Tara Bay in his flat once again, this time for a discussion and interview. Referring to his critics rather wistfully, as though he would prefer them as friends rather than enemies, Tara Bay said, "They think, for instance, that when I run hat pins through my jaws, then it is just a matter of forcing my will to resist the pain. Yet if that were true, why are there not scars on my body after I have been so badly wounded and cut? The fact is that they cannot get away from their accustomed ways of thinking. They cannot grasp the possibility of the truth of my own explanations. Let them try to stick knives and skewers into their own throats and faces. They will soon see the difference. They may keep on saying to themselves that they do not feel it, and they may try their utmost not to, but they certainly will do so." Then, by the way of explanation, Tara Bay continued, "Two secrets, hardly the correct term, but it will suffice, enable me to perform all my feats. They are pressure on certain nerve centers of the body and ability to enter the cataleptic coma. Anyone who is suited and is prepared to undergo the long training which I had to undergo in order to master the application of these two secrets may perform the same feat. Without such application, I could not perform the same feats, and I could, I could not claim the courage to resist the pain of these feats. I am not built like those Indian fakirs you have seen who voluptuously seek to torture themselves, endure voluntarily terrible sufferings dictated by the doctrines of their asceticism. The only things I share with them are, on the ascetic side, to live inwardly detached in spirit, and, on the side of practices, the swallowing backwards of the tongue and the entry into catalepsy." Tara Bay amplified his explanation that as the nerves are conductors of pain, finger pressure can draw the blood away from the brain on selected nerve centers so that they are struck with an anesthesia. One should not practice this without long and proper training. When this is accompanied by the complete swallowing backwards of the tongue and inhalation of air, rigid cataleptic coma is sure to follow, and the flesh becomes totally insensitive to pain, however intense. The nerve centers on which pressure is exercised are the carotid arteries serving the head, the hypnotic centers of the temples, and the pneumogastric nerves. But these are not to be played with. On the question of tongue swallowing, Tara Bay said that even when he was 4 months old, his father began to turn his tongue back with his finger, resulting in a kind of convulsive fit. Today I can swallow my tongue backward with ease and sometimes experience difficulty in returning it to its normal position. This seals the windpipe and also prevents the entrance of dangerous insects and germs while the body is lying helpless underground. Before entering catalepsy, yogis always prefix the moment of their awakening by means of autosuggestion. Just as one can go to sleep at night having decided the time of waking the following morning, this is proof that the subconscious mind never sleeps. It is only the conscious mind that undergoes such a lapse. It also explains why sleepwalkers often perform quite intelligent actions without remembering afterwards what they did. The beginning of the cataleptic trance, Tara Bay went on, brings about the cessation of two vital functions, namely breathing and blood circulation. Most people would declare that death must inevitably supervene, but he declined to argue the point as Brunton had already witnessed catalepsy in India. The point is that the whole rhythm of life is suspended. This is not the kind of catalepsy that is sometimes obtained in hypnotic experiments on other persons, in which the circulation of blood is intensified because the methods used are quite different and totally unrelated. And sensibility against pain lasts about 25 minutes after awakening from the second degree of trance. No such period marks the case of merely hypnotized subjects, although it is true that the latter can be rendered insensible to pain. To remain insensible to pain after the state has passed is another thing altogether. As to why Tara Bay's body remained unscathed after many stabs and wounds he had received during the course of his career, two things had to be done. One was to accelerate temporarily the blood circulation. The doctors found that the pulse rate rose to 130 during the actual demonstration. The swiftness of blood flow helping to heal the wound with amazing rapidity. The other was to raise the blood temperature to fever heat in order to disinfect the wounds of germs which may have been introduced. There is never any suppuration, and the wounds generally heal within a few minutes or, in more serious cases, in a few hours. Being buried alive is a practice was commonplace in ancient Egypt as in India. In those days, there was virtually no materialism. Everyone believed in the soul, and therefore such experiences were understood. The danger of modern habits of thinking is that it deprives men of that incalculable force, the power of the soul. By means of cataleptic entrancement, physical life is suspended, but the unseen life of the soul nevertheless continues to function. To demonstrate this demands long and severe training, which is usually begun at a very early age. There are certain parallels in the animal kingdom. Many amphibia, for instance, though breathing air, can remain underwater without air for many hours in winter hibernation when breathing and the blood flow is virtually suspended, or in some cases totally suspended, as in certain species of bats. As a well-known phenomenon, such animals are able to enter into a state of catalepsy, and if animals can do it, why not human beings, who after all possesses animal bodies? Tara Bay pointed out that were he not in a state of catalepsy during this experiment of being buried alive, he would suffocate within 10 minutes. Brunton asks if, when buried alive, the soul is detached from the body and enters the beyond, and what experiences can be remembered from that sphere. Tara Bay said he could tell nothing, as he did not wish to pose as a man knowing the secrets of the beyond. There are still mysterious depths, which we have as yet been unable to penetrate. The trouble is that we enter a similar state to that of sleepwalkers. When we return to normal life, we are unable to remember anything of apparently supernatural adventure. Perhaps we have explored the region of the world of spirits, but as we do not remember our experiences, we can say nothing of that world. He added, "We must accept the facts as we find them. However, I believe I returned as in a real death to unite my soul with universal soul, the unknown force. In that sense, I believe we are immortal." Although the interview continued for a while, it dealt mainly with the historical aspects of being buried alive and its effects on the body over relatively short periods. For Brunton, the demonstration had been dramatic in the extreme, while the philosophy behind its success always returned to the same basic tenets as he had encountered before. The overriding importance of the soul, the long and severe training and discipline required to perform such apparently miraculous feats, and, as always, the presence of an immortal, universal force or spirit which manifests itself through the souls of individual bodies. So the latter concept is, of course, the fundamental of Eastern religions and mysticism generally, but it also applies in a different way to Western religious beliefs. For Brunton, the interlude with Tara Bay was one of the most telling and sensational of his long quest through the East for the ultimate truth, and perhaps, in his own persistent way, he eventually found it. Wow, we actually got through that one. So that chapter of stories was known as The Mysterious Orient, and we went through those stories. The next one that we'll be reading for our next story time together is known as A Coven of Witches. So, I don't know yet. It might be on the 7th, 21st, or perhaps even the 29th or 22nd. I don't know. But we'll be continuing with this book, and I'm super stoked. And I'm so glad you guys could hang out with me on Friendship Day. Hanging out with my buddies. Hoping to see people in the after party to hang out with and hear, what's going on in everybody else's world. It gets boring being stuck in your own little world sometimes. You know what I'm saying? Are you feeling me? Are you picking up what I'm putting down? Holy cannoli. So yeah, that was a good book. Like I said, I didn't really dig too much the very first story that we went through. It was kind of just like way too detailed or whatever, and just way too not fun. It was kind of boring. No interesting facts for me, but I like the other ones. 50 Strange Stories of the Supernatural. True accounts of weird and otherworldly happenings. Edited by Mr. John Canning. And on the side, or what do they call this? The heel of the book? It says Bonanza at the bottom. So I wonder if that's the publishers. But again, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. It's been awesome hanging out with you. Oh man. Thank you so much for tuning in. And thank you for the compliments, Dennis, and other people who do enjoy this time. Whether you're just going about your everyday life or unpacking or whatever you may be doing. Thank you to all of our friends on We Are Paradox Media's Facebook, Spreaker, Twitter, Periscope, iHeartRadio, and wherever else you may be listening beyond the Omniverse tonight. I had a wonderful time this evening, and I can't wait to do it again next weekend. Saturday, like I said, could be Surprise Saturday, could be a special surprise guest going on, or it could be continuation of story time. On Sunday, we're joined by Mr. Waylon Colburn, and we'll be talking about Bigfoot, our brother from another mother. You guys don't forget, we are all in this together. Together we can make the world a little better. And together, my friends, we are Paradox Media, because without you, there is no us. Thank you again for hanging out with us on Friendship Day. It's Friendship Day. Do the friendship dance. If you guys would like to join us on the Skype after party, look me up at tessa.n.thomas30@gmail.com or give us a call at 970-335-9596. Until next time, nighty-night, love and light to all my friends and family out there. Thank you again so much for listening. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Don't work too hard. Stay calm, stay cool, stay collected, and I will see you back here, same time, same place.